Yeah, we just wanted to host a space where we could sort of have a conversation on what we just saw. For me, this is an incredibly emotional film. Even in this rewatch, I was pretty much crying on and off. So I really understand if a lot of people are sharing from a place of sort of like your emotional space, like that's allowed and that's totally acceptable. There's a lot of things that stood out to me in this film, but if anyone wants to say or express anything that's coming up for them and watching this, especially because it's a lot of triggering material, please feel free to do so. One thing that really stood out to me is the fact that this is a portion earlier in the film where the prime minister, states like everything is working in accordance to the democratic state. And that is something that really stood out to me because it's true that this sort of like chain reaction is like 100% like part and parcel of how a state responds to what it deems as like agitators that are like getting in the way of privatization of businesses and sort of like the economic growth of the country. Also, just the way, like the manipulation of language over and over again, like really stood out to me. Just the way that, I mean, this is a really classic technique, but the way that Ana Garcia and everyone sort of under him was continuously utilizing the language of like progress and modernity as something to say like, well, you're denying the chance for everyone else to be able to have progress in this country, or like, oh, well, it's such a shame that so much of the country isn't ready for, actually now I've just learned that when we try to introduce modernity, we have to do it a little bit slower because it's like a shock to people. And again, just like, this manipulation of language.
We're specifically belittling racist towards indigenous people.
Oh, of course, right? Like in every way.
Part and parcel with that goes to characterizing these people as savages, as backwards, as not wanting to participate.
Yeah.
And not allowing this progress.
Commenting on that, I think the director did a great job, like showing how white Peruvians treat indigenous as second-class citizens. Like, a lot of times they're like, these people don't have the same rights as we do, but like they keep on forgetting that they're also Peruvian.
Yeah.
So it's just like, it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
I think the themes of citizenry were very, very present in this one, and I think we also tried to other films we looked at in this month with the idea of indigenous people as being forced to be second-class citizens in the way they have continually, and up until the present day, up until 2009 and to this day, have to fight to be recognized as citizens of their country. I don't know if anybody would like to speak on that.
Well, it's just something to me that like one of the most like poignant moments in the film is when one of the like members of the community in the sort of like workshop like talk space is saying like policemen are considered heroes because they are like protecting against enemies. Like, what does that make us? Because that's the other thing, is that there's not just this theme of being considered in their case, actually, they keep saying third-class citizen, of being considered a third, which is like, okay, being considered a third-class citizen, but rather an enemy. And that is absolutely, in terms of action, how indigenous people who are like protesting specifically unconstitutional acts that, like, if the legal system were to sort of follow that logically, it would have been deemed unconstitutional in that way. There's this immediate identification as enemy, and that's why the state of emergency, like, who does that actually serve? And the same with essentially treating Alberto Casango as an enemy of the state. Like, all of that is just this like this escalation at the same time was very well oiled, because there was not a gap between the denial of being able to vote on the forestry law 1090 and the military police response. Like that was very strategic and immediate. And so like all of that to me just like again signals how much this was internally for the government, something that was like just carrying out the sort of like logical course of action without any consideration to like, yeah, how that actually functions.
I think that this moment for me was very strong when I don't remember the last name of the indigenous leader, but he went to an interview with this lady and she was like, you should be open to negotiation because I'm not staying without light because of your fault. And for her, it's about light and electricity, but for indigenous peoples, it's about their homes, their entire lives getting destroyed. So you see the way they're thinking about like them having more rights than other people.
As soon as it becomes about them and their comfort, it starts affecting them directly, all of a sudden it's a emergency.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was gonna say, throughout the entire film, it really never seemed like had the intention to even hear it all. It was almost like they were gaslighting indigenous communities the entire time.
Absolutely.
And completely just demonizing the leaders for wanting basic human rights for their communities. Like they just wanted these territories where it's enough. And the water was literally black. That's like unlivable.
That's, I mean, it's like a really, in terms of even like psychological manipulation, I feel like that is something that doesn't even get touched on in this film. It's just, the way that, you know, how are you supposed to feel or what course of action are you supposed to feel that you have when, you know, the government can claim one thing, but then immediately escalate the situation and then say, how dare you, why did you just escalate the situation? That's so crazy, I thought you wanted dialogue. And it's like, I also thought that it was just like, because this is of course, now, you know, it's like over a decade later in Peru's history. That's also really interesting to me in terms of the like concept of collective trauma, because I feel like this had a huge impact on the Amazonian communities. And this is something that I think when you talk to someone who lives, you know, on the coast, they don't have as much consciousness. If anything, they might remember a time in their life when resources were slower to arrive from the Amazon, and just sort of vaguely be like, right, when there was some policeman that was killed, versus the way that this is remembered in the Amazon is totally different. And that's also something in terms of building trust in communities, or sort of like being able to have dialogue. This is like enough time has passed for this to truly be a source of like collective trauma that is being like passed on in this way. So I think that's also really like worth holding as context, even is in terms of like how people are trying to approach dialogue. Is it's like for a lot of people, they have like firsthand lived experience of what happens when they try to tell the state that their lives and their homes are being like threatened. And I mean, people in Lima can't really say the same. But yet there's obviously this like assumption of like, oh, well, you know, why don't you just do some sort of peaceful demonstration? But like, there's obviously precedent.
Throughout the movie that I thought was cool to touch on was this sort of mutual understanding that the police and the indigenous communities had for a while. I remember that scene from the beginning of the movie where the people were chanting, "Our fight is not with you, brother policeman, our fight is with the government." And it seemed like the police officers very much had a similar understanding. So I think it's very, like, that was a very prevalent theme, idea of like brothers, compatriots, fellow citizens having to fight each other at the whim of this government and these international companies. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts they'd like to share about that. But I think it's something that you could see was particularly traumatic for both sides, right? Especially with, for example, the father of the policeman he harbored no ill will towards indigenous people or things like that. But it's just more sort of like the trauma and the pain instilled by this conflict. That was fomented by people who didn't have to live any sort of it, right? By these legislators and these international companies that were so detached from it, but still has deeply affected people. So,
From that scene that you're talking about, was it the one where there was one policeman that's stepped forward and was like, we support you, but like we can't support you because we're with the government, basically.
Yeah, I think right after that they showed a shot of the people who were running through some years, but they were settled.
Yeah, nuestra lucha no es contigo, la lucha es contra el gobierno. That, when I first saw the film, that was something that I later revisited as a clip because I just thought that it was so lucid in terms of like understanding on an interpersonal level, because at the end of the day, it's like you as a human being, you're being presented with other people before you, to have that like understanding in that moment of like how to interpret the situation of like you're here because you are representing the state and the state's interests. I'm not here for you specifically, I'm here for the state, and like to actually be able to verbalize that to the person before you, sort of as like a preface to anything that might happen afterwards, because even in those clips we still saw violence. Like that wasn't the actual sort of like what they call clash in Bawa, but there was still like violence that occurred on that bridge. But to be able to sort of verbalize that, I think is really important as setting an intention, and just even having this like acknowledgement of like, you are here because you're representing someone. That's who my actual problem is with. And I felt that in a lot of levels, that is something that is really necessary to sort of ground, I guess, the politics of like, because in terms of even like what I read what Pisano said towards the end, where he was saying like, I am following my specific code, which dictates that like even the life of an ant like has the right to like be alive and to be free from harm. And that's also in that way just like a sharing of the philosophy, which in and of itself, like that's why there was still violence, because I think, you know, like the police weren't necessarily in that moment, like they were like following orders, and the concept of order is something that like they get to decide what that looks like. But it was, yeah, it just like really like impacted me to see this like verbalization of, yeah.
I find it really odd then, because they were following the government's orders, yet they wouldn't take responsibility for like
Exactly.
the police officers or the native people. They're like, yeah, we had nothing to do with this. But it's like, where are they coming from? They just like appeared.
Exactly. And the way that the government couldn't fathom why certain people would be holding them accountable and responsible, and saying like, well, we need to find these agitators and instigators who are external actors and punish them to the full extent of the law. Even though I'm sure like all of them full well knew, right, like, oh, behind closed doors we issued, we called the military and issued a state of emergency and asked for them to enter this region. So like, and it's like actual human beings who were in that room in that moment, you know, who were also like, well, why would you say that? Or even when there was like, you know, disorder in the court, and they were, one of the congresswomen actually had like the guts to say, you know, like this particular, all of us right here right now have blood on our hands from what has happened. And immediately, you know, the prime minister was like, I'm not going to answer this anymore. How dare you say that?
Like, told her to shut up.
Yeah, he told her to shut up.
The immature.
Yeah, I think just as a documentary also, it's very important, like what doesn't get captured and what does get captured, like that's always really fascinating to me, like, you know, who we're following as a sort of protagonist. And I felt that it was really important the way that this documentary stays with all of the sort of like results and consequences up until the very moment that, because this film was released in 2016. So, they're giving you, information up until 2016. But even in following through, like what happened to this policeman who was disappeared, like that to me shows that, this filmmaker, well, it was actually technically two filmmakers, and I also, there's like editors and whatever. But just like showing that, like, in accordance to the way that members of the actual community, or like the fact that it had to escalate to like the spilling of like human lives is like not something that they had wanted, because it's not in accordance with like their beliefs. I just felt like it was then important to kind of ground in that understanding, to then follow through, like, okay, here's what it looks like when someone is then like looking for their child, and here is the like result of that, and letting him be able to say the state is who is accountable for this. Like that to me felt really important, because I feel like it's really easy to dismiss this as like, okay, well, this is just wholly an Indigenous issue, and that's only how these particular people feel about this. But to then be able to provide someone who, in any other framing, might have just been considered like the opposition, to still have the same belief of like, this is ultimately the state's responsibility. And also, again, because of foreign businesses, that just felt like a really important platform to be able to give in that moment, so that it doesn't get like obfuscated as like, this is a very binary issue between Indigenous people and, like basically every other, both like business and government, yes, but also like everyday citizens, which is what I feel like a lot of the media that's represented in this documentary is in that moment was doing. Like a lot of the news agencies, are saying like, why are you doing this to everyday citizens? Why are you doing this to people who need like electricity, etc.? And so then to at least be able to dismantle that within the medium itself. Really important to me, yeah.
Another important thing about that, and we talked about like the ideas of citizenry and just not being included in the nation. A lot of the people, Alan Garcia and his government, a lot of the news reporters are sort of getting it like, oh, it's Peru against these indigenous communities, but then that inherently excludes those communities from being part of Peru.
Yeah.
So things again talks about the very tricky idea of citizenship and how historically, not just in Peru, not just in South America, but throughout Latin America, indigenous people have been excluded from citizenship since independence.
Dad actually told me that there are still communities without electricity, and then if you want to go to a hospital, you have to like take it from there or travel for hours because there aren't like hospitals right in the communities.
And it talks about how these people have not been integrated into the nation. The promise to them of citizenship, of resources, of everything that they should deserve as nation, as citizens of the nation, has not been fulfilled. And so that to this day, governments still need to step up and give the indigenous people the rights that they've been promised for so long. I think it's something we definitely ties into the previous events we've had this month. I don't know if you guys are attending it, but we talked about similar struggles of indigenous people in the 60s and 70s in Peru's highlands. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to open the dialogue to see if you guys think of any other connections to other indigenous struggles in Peru, elsewhere, other times, things like that connect many of the things we saw here today.
Well, I mean, for me, I'm from Minnesota, and I don't know if you guys have heard about Line 3, but it's a tar sands line that goes to Canada, and there's a lot of resistance to it this past summer, especially because it was so close to completion, and it has, unfortunately, it's like completion.
Yeah.
But I think it was really striking to me how similar the progression of events from the government specifically were, like their response to each part, and how it was almost like, it felt like, it's like they have like a list or something,
right,
like what they do when they face resistance.
Yeah. So that is precisely the point of it all, where he was like, this is how like a functional democratic state will respond to things or whatever. I don't remember the exact quote, but like that is actually like that's right. Like it will respond with this exact amount of violence and this total disregard for like dialogue, yes, but also like shirking responsibility and accountability. And you're right, it feels like there's this just like rule book of already like, okay, here are the set things that you should do to respond to particularly land-based or like environmental, I guess you would call it like activism or protesting or whatnot. And that's what's really sort of shocking to me is because, you know, all of the common threads in this is that it's like state authority that is sort of protecting like private enterprise interests. And it's really like formulaic. And that's what's so scary too, is just like the impersonal nature of it in that sense. Like how easily replicated it can be, and just sort of like, because it's like just a facet of I mean, yeah, like state in general, like you just sort of tailor certain parts of your response to whatever region, but it all seems to be from the same playbook. And that is what like really disillusions me a lot, is just, yeah, like the impersonal nature of it, because then you have these very visceral pleas of humanity that are also captured in this film, which are what is most affective for me, is just like actually hearing people like, I mean, because to be at that point where you have to genuinely be begging for water and for clean air, like that is like, that's a human being that is like pushed to the absolute extreme. But I don't think that anyone who is, you know, having any of these mandates actually understands the like guttural, sort of like visceral, emotional, and like totally embodied response that actually provokes. And that to me is what like actually causes me despair, is when I like am seeing just how embodied the responses to this are, and then the total like impersonal, like just like lack of acknowledgement and everything, because it's two extremes, and like within those extremes it's like really difficult to feel that there's any like sense of, I don't like justice or like decency or like any of that. And it's yeah, that's sort of what this film definitely also provokes in me as like as an emotional response, and like why I was like crying a lot when I was watching this film, is because it like really grounds me in the dismissal of things that I feel are so fundamental to like being alive. Yeah. Not to like, you know I kind of like suggested this film, and so in a lot of ways I'm like responsible for the vibes that I'm like causing, but I just like, I really feel like part of also why I wanted to screen this is because I feel like the Amazon in particular has such an abstract attention to it. Like we just talk about it as though like, okay, it's the lungs of the world, or like, oh, the rainforest has like X percentage of biodiversity, and it's, you know, these facts that have nothing to do with the actual reality and like lived experience of what it's like to have this as your home, and to have this as, you know, like a place that nourishes and provides for you.
Yeah, just a comment. I think you guys know I'm indigenous, but I used to like go to the Amazon every summer. Yeah. And I stopped going once I moved to the US. But then this past summer I went to the Amazon, and like how much it has changed. It's insane. Like before, like there was literally no electricity, and like that's how we live, right? But now it's like there's no more forest at all in like regions where people used to live, and it's just crazy because like all the resources from indigenous have been taken, so now they cannot even feed themselves. Right. So now there's like these huge migration movements going on. And like even here, like there's a lot of questioning of why a lot of people from Central America, like Honduras or El Salvador, are moving, and there's this mass migration going on. But that's the reason. That's literally the reason. It's because not only the US, but like a lot of big countries are just expanding and expanding without realizing, and then there's like the depletion of people all over the world. You know what I mean? So it's like this movie touches on these huge issues that are going on, and people are just not talking enough about them.
Thank you so much.